Florence, 1513. A man sits alone in a cold room, ink staining his fingers, his wrists still bearing the marks of rope burns from weeks of torture on the Strappado. His name is Niccolo Machiavelli. He has just been accused of conspiracy, stripped of every title, dragged from his home, and hung by his wrists until his shoulders nearly dislocated. The men who ordered his torture were not strangers. They were people he had served faithfully for 14 years. People he had advised, protected, and helped rise to power. And as he sits in that freezing exile, writing the pages that would become the most dangerous political treatise in history, he is not motivated by revenge. He is motivated by a single burning question, one that had haunted him through every betrayal, every false alliance, every smile that concealed a knife. Why do the people closest to you become the ones most eager to destroy you? What Machiavelli discovered in that exile, what he encoded into 7 brutal laws of power, was not just political strategy. It was a psychological blueprint for understanding the darkest currents of human nature. And if you have ever sensed that people around you harbor a quiet hostility they never speak aloud, if you have ever watched someone smile at you while working against you in silence, then these 7 laws were written for you, not to make you cruel, to make you impossible to destroy. Before we enter the 7 laws, you need to understand something that Machiavelli grasped more clearly than any philosopher before or since. Hatred does not begin where you think it does. Most people imagine that enemies are created through conflict, through arguments, through offenses, through direct harm. But Machiavelli observed the courts of Renaissance Italy for decades, and what he saw shattered that assumption entirely. The most dangerous enemies were never the ones you wronged. They were the ones you outgrew. He wrote in The Prince that men are driven by 2 principal impulses, love and fear. But beneath both of these, Machiavelli identified something even more primal, the impulse to preserve one's own significance. Every human being carries an internal narrative about who they are, where they stand, and what they deserve. And whenever another person, through their mere existence, disrupts that narrative, the mind does not calmly adjust. It attacks, not openly, not honestly, but through a slow, invisible campaign of resentment that operates entirely beneath the surface of polite interaction. This is why you have felt it, the strange silences when you enter certain rooms, the praise that somehow feels hollow, the friends who celebrate your failures more enthusiastically than your victories. You were not imagining it. You were sensing a mechanism that has operated in human psychology since the beginning of civilization. And Machiavelli did not just describe this mechanism. He codified 7 laws for transforming it from a vulnerability into your greatest source of power. Law 1. Never explain yourself to those who have already decided to misunderstand you. Machiavelli wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." This single observation contains the first and perhaps most important law of dealing with hidden enemies. When someone secretly resents you, they have already constructed a version of you inside their mind. This internal version is not based on who you actually are. It is based on what they need you to be in order to protect their ego. If they feel inadequate, they have decided you are arrogant. If they feel ignored, they have decided you are attention-seeking. If they feel powerless, they have decided you are controlling. And here is the critical insight. No amount of explanation will change their internal narrative, because their hatred was never about your behavior. It was about their interpretation of your existence. Consider what happened to Cesare Borgia, one of the figures Machiavelli studied most closely. Borgia was a man of extraordinary capability. He unified fractured territories, established order where there had been chaos, and governed with remarkable efficiency. Yet the nobles around him grew to despise him, not because he was cruel to them, but because his competence exposed their incompetence. Borgia made a fatal mistake in his later years. He began trying to win the affection of those who had already decided to hate him. He made concessions, he softened his approach, he explained his reasoning, and every explanation was interpreted as weakness. Every concession was interpreted as fear. The law is clear. When hatred is rooted in insecurity, explanation feeds it. Silence starves it. Your power begins the moment you stop defending yourself to people who were never interested in understanding you. You do not owe your narrative to anyone who has already written their own version. Law 2. Make your absence more powerful than your presence. Machiavelli observed a pattern among the most effective rulers of his time. The ones who maintained the longest grip on power were not those who were constantly visible. They were the ones who understood the psychological weight of disappearance. He wrote, The wish to acquire is in truth very natural and common, and men always do so when they can. What Machiavelli understood was that human desire intensifies around what is scarce and diminishes around what is abundant. This applies not only to wealth and territory, it applies to you. When someone secretly resents you, your constant presence gives them a target. Every word you speak becomes material for their internal prosecution. Every action you take is filtered through their lens of hostility. But the moment you withdraw, strategically, deliberately, without anger or drama, something extraordinary happens. The narrative they constructed about you begins to collapse. Because hatred requires proximity to sustain itself. It needs fresh evidence, fresh provocations, fresh material. Without your presence, the mind of your enemy is left alone with its own projections, and projections without reinforcement eventually dissolve into uncertainty. History demonstrates this repeatedly. When Lorenzo de' Medici faced growing conspiracies among Florentine nobles, his most effective strategy was not confrontation. It was selective withdrawal. He would disappear from public life for weeks, retreat to his villa, attend no gatherings, respond to no invitations, and in that absence, his enemies, deprived of a target, would begin turning on each other. Because here's the truth about people who secretly hate you. Their hostility is rarely exclusive. The same insecurity that makes them resent you makes them resent anyone who threatens their ego. Remove yourself from the equation, and they will find a new mirror to despise. But there is a deeper power in strategic absence. It forces people to reconsider your value. When you are always available, always present, always responding, people begin to take you for granted. Your presence becomes background noise. But when you withdraw, the silence you leave behind becomes louder than anything you could have said. The law is this: do not fight for space in rooms where your absence would be felt more deeply than your words. Law 3. Guard your reputation as if it were your life, because to your enemies, it is the only battlefield that matters. Machiavelli wrote with chilling clarity, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see but few can feel." This single sentence explains why reputation is not merely important, it is everything. Your enemies will never attack you directly. That would expose them. Instead, they attack your reputation. They plant seeds of doubt through casual remarks. "Oh, they are not as talented as people think. I have heard some things. They seem nice, but..." These fragments of doubt travel faster than any truth you could speak, because the human mind is wired to give more weight to negative information than positive. Psychologists call this negativity bias. One piece of gossip carries more psychological weight than 10 compliments. And your enemies instinctively understand this, even if they have never read a psychology textbook. Consider what happened to Savonarola, the fiery preacher who briefly controlled Florence after the Medici were expelled. Savonarola was brilliant, charismatic, and genuinely believed in his cause, but he neglected his reputation. He assumed that righteousness would protect him. He assumed that truth would be enough. His enemies did not challenge his ideas, they challenged his character. Slowly, methodically, they spread whispers. They questioned his motives. They suggested hidden agendas. And by the time Savonarola realized what was happening, the narrative had already shifted. The same crowds that once adored him watched him burn. The law demands this. You must actively shape how others perceive you, or your enemies will shape it for you. This does not mean being dishonest. It means being intentional. Control what you reveal. Choose your associations carefully. Let your actions speak with unmistakable clarity, so that no whisper can rewrite what people have witnessed with their own eyes. When your reputation is solid, built on consistent behavior and undeniable results, gossip finds no fertile ground. It lands and withers. But when your reputation is unguarded, even the smallest seed of doubt can grow into a forest of suspicion. If you are beginning to recognize these patterns in your own life, if something in these laws is finally naming what you have felt but never understood, consider subscribing. This channel explores the psychology of power, perception, and self-mastery at a depth most content never reaches. And we are only halfway through the 7 laws. What comes next may be the most important part. Law 4. Never reveal the full depth of what you feel, because emotions displayed are weapons handed to your enemies. This is perhaps the most misunderstood of all Machiavellian principles. It is not about becoming cold. It is not about suppressing your humanity. It is about understanding that in any environment where hidden hostility exists, your emotions are intelligence, and intelligence shared carelessly becomes ammunition. Machiavelli wrote, "It is double pleasure to deceive the deceiver." But the deeper wisdom in this statement is not about deception. it is about information asymmetry. The person who reveals less always holds more power, because every emotion you display publicly teaches your enemies exactly how to manipulate you. If they see that criticism wounds you, they will criticize. If they see that exclusion disturbs you, they will exclude. If they see that success excites you, they will work to undermine it, not because they benefit from your failure, but because your pain restores the emotional balance they lost when your success made them feel inferior. Consider the case of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan. Sforza was a man of tremendous ambition and considerable intelligence, but he had one fatal weakness. He could not conceal his emotions. When he was pleased, the entire court knew. When he was threatened, his anxiety was visible in his voice, his gestures, his decisions. His enemies studied him like a text. They learned that flattery made him generous, that threats made him reckless, that isolation made him desperate, and they used each of these emotional patterns to systematically dismantle his power, one calculated provocation at a time. Contrast this with someone like Ferdinand of Aragon, whom Machiavelli admired precisely for his emotional opacity. Ferdinand could receive devastating news with the same expression he wore receiving a compliment. His enemies never knew what he was thinking. And that uncertainty, that inability to predict his reactions, became his greatest shield. The law teaches this: feel everything but reveal strategically. Your inner world is sacred territory. Not everyone who asks how you feel deserves an honest answer. Not every provocation requires a visible response. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to wound you is to remain utterly, impossibly still. Because composure is not emptiness. It is fullness under control. And nothing unsettles an enemy more than the realization that their attacks are landing on a surface they cannot crack. Law 5. Be generous, but never so generous that you make yourself dispensable, and never so generous that you create expectations you cannot sustain. Machiavelli wrote one of the most counterintuitive passages in political philosophy when he observed that excessive generosity ultimately leads to hatred. This seems paradoxical. How can giving too much create resentment? But the psychology beneath this law is devastatingly precise. When you give freely, your time, your energy, your knowledge, your emotional labor, people initially appreciate it. But appreciation has a half-life. The more consistently you give, the faster gratitude decays into expectation. And the moment you stop giving at the level people have grown accustomed to, they do not think, they gave me so much. They think, why did they stop? This is the generosity trap, and it is one of the most common mechanisms through which good people create their own enemies. Think about this in your own life. Have you ever been the person who always helped, always listened, always showed up, only to discover that the one time you could not, people reacted with irritation rather than understanding? That irritation was not random. It was the predictable result of generosity that had been given without boundaries. Machiavelli studied Pope Julius II, who understood this law instinctively. Julius never gave anything without ensuring the recipient understood the cost. Not in a transactional way, in a way that preserved the weight of the gift. When he offered support to an ally, the ally knew it was a deliberate choice, not an automatic reflex. And because of this, every act of generosity carried the power of intention rather than the weakness of habit. The law demands this. Give with purpose, not with compulsion. Your generosity should feel like sunlight breaking through clouds, not like a faucet that never stops running. When you give selectively, each gift carries weight. When you give indiscriminately, even your greatest sacrifices become invisible. And here's the hidden power within this law. When you establish boundaries around your generosity, you simultaneously establish your value. People begin to understand that your time, your attention, and your energy are not infinite resources to be consumed. They are gifts to be earned. And that shift in perception transforms you from someone who can be exploited into someone who commands genuine respect. Law 6. Do not avoid conflict, control it. Because the conflict you refuse to face on your terms will eventually find you on its terms. This may be the law that separates those who are consumed by hidden enemies from those who transform enmity into fuel. Machiavelli was explicit. Wars are not avoided but are only postponed to the advantage of others. Most people who discover they are secretly hated respond in one of two ways. They either withdraw entirely, hoping the hostility will dissolve on its own, or they explode, confronting their enemies in a burst of emotion that often makes the situation worse. Both responses surrender control. Machiavelli advocated for a third path, strategic confrontation. Not aggression, not avoidance, but the deliberate choice of where and how to address conflict. Consider the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, one of the most dramatic episodes in Florentine history. The Pazzi family, consumed by envy of the Medici's rising power, plotted to assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano de' Medici during Easter Mass. Giuliano was killed. Lorenzo survived, wounded. What happened next defined Lorenzo's legacy. He did not retreat into grief. He did not lash out blindly. Instead, he responded with calculated, measured, devastating precision. He identified every conspirator. He dismantled the Pazzi network methodically. He made public examples of those who had betrayed him. Not through cruelty, but through the systematic removal of their influence, their alliances, and their credibility. And then he did something extraordinary. He forgave certain lesser conspirators. Not all of them. Only those whose forgiveness would demonstrate his strength rather than his weakness. Because Lorenzo understood that mercy, when delivered from a position of power, is not softness. It is the most terrifying display of dominance imaginable. It says, I could destroy you, and I choose not to. Remember that. The law teaches this. Conflict is not the enemy. Controlled conflict is the enemy. When you choose the moment, the method, and the message of your confrontation, you transform from a target into a force. And your enemies, the ones who operated in whispers and shadows, suddenly realize that the person they were quietly undermining is not someone who can be quietly destroyed. Law 7. Use the hatred of others as the raw material for your own evolution. This is the final law, and it is the one that transforms everything that came before it from strategy into philosophy. Because Machiavelli, for all his reputation as a cold pragmatist, understood something profoundly spiritual about the nature of opposition. He wrote, where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great. But the deeper meaning is this. The obstacles others place in your path do not weaken you. They define you. Every person who secretly works against you is, without intending to, sculpting you into someone stronger, more perceptive, more resilient than you would have become without their opposition. Think about what hatred teaches you. It teaches you to read people, not their words, but their silences, their micro-expressions, the gap between what they say and what they mean. It teaches you emotional discipline, because you learn that reacting impulsively to every provocation drains you, while composure preserves your energy for what truly matters. It teaches you self-reliance, because you discover that the only approval that can never be taken from you is your own. Machiavelli himself is the greatest example of this law. When he was tortured, exiled, and stripped of everything he had built, he did not collapse. He wrote. He channeled every betrayal, every false friend, every calculated cruelty into pages that would outlive every single person who tried to destroy him. The Prince was not written from comfort. It was written from the ashes of a destroyed career, a broken body, and a heart that had witnessed the full spectrum of human treachery. And yet it endures, 5 centuries later, as one of the most penetrating examinations of power ever committed to paper. Your enemies do not know it, but they are doing you a favor. Every person who secretly resents you is revealing exactly where your power lies, because people do not hate what is weak. They do not envy what is failing. They do not whisper about what is insignificant. The very existence of their hostility is proof that you possess something they recognize as valuable, something they wish they had. And the moment you understand this, truly, deeply understand it, the dynamic shifts permanently. You stop fearing their hatred. You stop trying to disarm it through people-pleasing or self-diminishment. Instead, you begin to see it for what it is. Involuntary applause from people who will never admit they are watching. So here you stand with 7 laws that Machiavelli scattered across his writings like seeds in exile soil, now gathered into a single framework. Never explain yourself to those who chose misunderstanding. Make your absence more powerful than your presence. Guard your reputation as sacred ground. Conceal the full depth of your emotions. Give with intention, never from compulsion. Choose your conflicts. Never let them choose you. And transform every ounce of opposition into fuel for your becoming. But there is something beyond the laws themselves that must be said. Because the true power of this knowledge does not lie in manipulation. It does not lie in games or strategies or calculated moves. It lies in liberation. When you understand why people secretly hate you, when you see the machinery of envy, insecurity, and wounded pride operating beneath polite surfaces, something inside you relaxes. The confusion lifts, the self-doubt quiets, the desperate question that has followed you through friendships, workplaces, and family gatherings, what did I do wrong, finally receives its true answer. Nothing. You did nothing wrong. You existed. You grew. You refused to shrink. And that was enough to disturb the comfort of people who had built their identity on the assumption that no one around them would ever rise above the invisible ceiling they had accepted for themselves. Machiavelli spent his final years in quiet exile, writing letters, tending his small farm, watching the political world he had once shaped continue without him. But here is what his enemies never understood. They removed him from power, but they could not remove the power from him. Because what Machiavelli possessed was not a title or a position. It was perception. It was the ability to see human nature as it truly is, not as we wish it were, and to act accordingly. That is the inheritance he left for you. Not cynicism, not paranoia, but clarity. The kind of clarity that allows you to walk through a world full of hidden agendas, masked resentments, and silent competitions, and remain untouched. Not because you are naive, but because you are awake. And that wakefulness, that refusal to be destroyed by what you now understand, is the most powerful form of victory there is. If these words reached something inside you that has been waiting to be named, if you are someone who chooses depth over distraction, clarity over comfort, truth over pleasant illusion, then you are exactly who this channel was created for. Subscribe now, and leave a comment below. Which of the 7 laws hit you the hardest? And what situation in your life does it explain? Your reflection might be the exact thing someone else scrolling through these comments needs to read tonight. Remember, they did not hate you because you were wrong. They hated you because you were undeniable. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one. Your reflection may become the catalyst for someone else's awakening, because this is not content for passive consumption. This is wisdom for those who are done being silent about the games others play in the dark. Machiavelli died in exile, stripped of position and power, yet his words outlived every prince who dismissed him. He understood what you now understand, that the greatest revenge against those who underestimate you is not destruction, but irrelevance. Yours toward them, theirs in the story you write without them. So carry these 7 laws not as armor, but as vision, not as weapons against the world, but as clarity through its fog. The people who secretly hate you are no longer your problem, they are your proof. Proof that you have chosen a path that demands more than they are willing to become. If this awakens something in you that refuses to go back to sleep, subscribe now and join those who choose power through clarity. Drop a comment below. Which law will you apply first and to whom? Your answer might set someone else free.